Hey, it's Aaron from Knights of Last Call. I wanted to talk to you guys today about a campaign we just finished, and also a campaign guide slash house rule document slash bullshit that we wanted to release to the patrons. So some of you may know that in our home private game, we played a campaign called The Dark of Winter. I've got the book here for it. And I just kind of wanted to talk about it a little bit, go over it, why we did it, why we built it, and what we thought we liked about it, what we didn't like about it, and kind of explain, some of the ideas behind it before we hand it out to you guys, right? To hopefully enjoy and have fun, or worst case scenario, just shit all over it completely and complain about how terrible it is on the Discord. So to give a little context about where this came from. Earlier in the year, I got really sick, and I live in Ohio, and it was dark and cold, and so I decided I hated winter and everything. So I wrote this book, and part of the reason I wrote this book is because I also hated Bob and Pathfinder. So I decided that I was going to make a serious troll about the Pathfinder experience just for Bob, a campaign that Bob would really like, and in this way also I could torment Derek, who I also hate. It worked to great success, right? So the premise of this campaign, if you haven't already heard about it, is that every level you go into a dungeon and you go in and you fight a boss, right? And you level up, you get stronger so that you can fight the next boss. And you just do that 20 times in a row. And it was great because Bob loved it up until the end, where he hated it and now just wants to go and play Root. So great success there. So when I started to write this, I hadn't DM'd Pathfinder before, and decided, hey, let me take a look at this game that everyone's talking about and super excited about. So I read to about page 2. And at that point, I kind of just stopped because I knew where the rest of the book was going, right? So I didn't really need to read the rest of it.
I've seen everything. I've seen it all.
And then I went out and wrote a 700-page house rule document that fixed all the problems that were in this book. So, and that's what you guys are getting today. So, joking aside, there's some degree of truth to that, but this isn't actually a house rule document, really. I'm not changing a lot specifically in Pathfinder in this. Like, what this really is kind of like a wrapper around it to kind of just extend things that I thought would be interesting and cool, but also provide some really heavy structure into the game. This campaign, just to be very clear, is not for everyone. I think that this is a good game for someone who needs a little bit more rigidness and how they approach a game, particularly if they want to try to do something a little bit more old school. But I want to be very clear, this is not an old school game, right? This is a board game for Pathfinder, really, if you get down into it. It's inspired by games. I think I talked about this here at the beginning of the book. It's inspired by games like Gloomhaven, but also Torchbearer, which is a really weird mix if you think about it. But I think it does actually hit those two concepts pretty well. So really, in the spirit of Knights of Last Call education, what I think this does well is it takes the newer generation of gamers that we're very fortunate to have in our Discord and in our Patreon, and it kind of shows them concepts from an older time when the game was more about like dungeons, right, and less about plot, and exposes those concepts to them, but in a very Pathfinder-ish way, right? So I think it's more of like sprinkles of that old school around Pathfinder. But in terms of actually changing the game, I don't really do that too much. There might be a couple rules in here just to make this function specifically, things like dealing with time and stuff, because there's a flavor of attrition that goes into exploring a delve, which Pathfinder 2 basically got rid of. It's not very strong, but it does exist, right? So some things play around with that concept a little bit, but for the most part, it's Pathfinder 2, and Dungeon Masters are free to, Game Masters are free to use whatever house rules and what they want. So, for example, I don't talk about free archetype in here because that's a personal choice. You can do that, right? And I don't specifically mess with hero points. If that's something where you really like what Derek's doing with his hero points, you could take that too, right? If you're doing all kinds of other crazy things, Ven likes to, change classes around pretty significantly. You can throw that in here. The game does assume the core balance, right? It assumes that you're playing Pathfinder 2, so just be aware, like with any house rule, if you mix that up, that this will work differently. But in general, this kind of fits around the game, and when you really get into it, particularly like the combat or the character advancement, you're just playing Pathfinder, and it's not anything particular there. So, but anyways, what I wanted to do today is kind of go over this. This should be releasing hopefully with this video, and I believe this is going to Champions and Heroes. So have fun and feel free to ping me if you have any questions or complaints. I'm going to go over the high levels of this document here, talk about kind of what's in this book, talk a little bit about things that we liked, things that we didn't like, things that we actually changed from this book. And this is going to be an unscripted video, so I'm going to kind of just go off this book. I'm going to try not to keep it too long. I do tend to ramble much like Derek, so I apologize ahead of time. But let's just get started with it, right? So in the beginning of the book, there's a couple sections. I'm just going to read the table of contents for people who may not have this or see this later. And there's a lot of like background information and in general, like what is this about kind of stuff, right? So you have, the beginning of the book, you have the chapter called Delvers, which is what the heroes are called. And that kind of sets up like, who are the players? What are they doing? What is this world that they're in? Talks about how adventures work. Again, adventures are pretty structured. They're going to follow a similar format throughout the campaign. Talks about the settlement rules, wilderness rules, the delve rules. Talks about the Dark of Winter. The Dark of Winter is the conclusion of this campaign. This campaign I'm going to just edit this and splice in some images because I don't have Derek's proficiency. I'm not used to the mirroring yet, so it's throwing me off. But the Dark of Winter is the end of the campaign, right? And like a board game, this campaign has a defined end and a defined beginning, and you progress towards that, towards the end. And then there's the largest part of the book, about over half of the book, is the Gamemaster section, right? Which actually tells you how to run this book. So this book is for players and for game masters. I obviously I let my players read the Gamemaster section so they knew how it was working mechanically. You don't have to hide it from them. But you can do whatever you want with that. The way I phrased it was that, for mandatory reading, the players needed to read the first part of the book, right? But the players don't have to read the second half of the book unless they're interested in it. So the idea here is that there is a little campaign setting. There's a little bit of flavor. It talks about kind of the world. It talks about how, it ended and, there was a great winner. And, if you read this and know me remotely at all, you're going to go, oh, this is, definitely inspired by Wheel of Time, which is 100% true. It's inspired by Wheel of Time. It's also inspired by a microscope campaign that I and the Knights played in, that Derek ran briefly. And I really liked how that campaign came together. And that microscope campaign was also inspired by Wheel of Time. So basically, I like Wheel of Time. And that's kind of the end of the video. There's other things in here too, but it talks a little bit about that, kind of sets up the story of why these things work. A lot of this is gameplay cover, right? So downtime is a big part of this game and how it works, and downtime is a resource. But, the players don't have infinite downtime. Well, why is that? Well, there's a MacGuffin in here called Australium, which is basically what powers everything to keep, the remnants of society alive in the frozen apocalyptic winter that they're in. And delvers go out into the world, into the delves, to find more Australium to keep everyone alive. And, if you don't have that or you run out of it, then everyone's going to die. So that's why you have a limit on downtime, because your downtime is calculated by how much Australium that you bring back. And if you don't bring back enough, well, you're going to have less downtime. So that's the premise of the campaign. Again, you can kind of put this wherever you want. You don't have to go up to Steam. In fact, you could take this book and just take it for the tables and the systems that are in it. There are aspects of this that, if you don't care about the setting, just take it and use it in whatever you want, and it should be fine. It was kind of written in that mindset. So, so then in the first section of the book, we also have a map. This is very important, right? Bob felt this was the most important part of the entire book, was the map, the abstract map for the setting that doesn't matter. So there's a map. Cool. All right. And then we get into the actual book. So the premise of this game and how it works, I kind of mentioned this before, is that, every session is one dungeon, a delve, as we call it. And at the end of that, whether you live or die, you gain a level. And live or die is a real thing. You don't die in this adventure. And these things may seem very shocking to you, right? Depending on how much you pay attention on the channel, everything I just described is complete hearsay nonsense, and you've just lost all respect. But the truth is this is kind of a message that we've always really had, particularly with Pathfinder 2. Pathfinder 2, in our opinion, just doesn't really handle death very well. The game doesn't want you to die. The APs don't want you to die. The designers don't want you to die, right? They want you to feel like you can die. They want that tension, right? They want that roller coaster ride. But much like a roller coaster, the designers, the architects of the roller coaster want you to get on the ride and have a good time and be scared and thrilled. But they don't want you to die, because that causes problems for the roller coaster if people start dying on them, right? So that's a lot like Pathfinder 2. The game just doesn't support it well. If you've watched any of the spell streams recently and Derek's talking about Raised Dead and whatnot, or if you've listened to the podcast, the game just doesn't support it. It doesn't work very well for numerous reasons, and you can go there and we'll go into it for that. So that was a big reason why in this game we basically got rid of death. Now, that's not to say there isn't defeat. There is still defeat. You can still lose. And it's funny because now the stakes don't have to be pulled back, right? Even a GM who doesn't fudge has to sit there and go, well, this encounter might wreck the party, right? Like, it might end it all. And if you've invested in a campaign for any amount of time, you know that can be devastating, right? There's none of that here. And here, the dice fall where they may, the encounters fall where they may. And if, the setup is just bad and unfortunate for the players, so be it. It's on them to figure it out. And then, by the way, when they do figure it out, how awesome is that? They pulled out a win, and it's great. And if they don't figure it out, well, listen, it's not the end of the campaign. Bad things happen. The dark side gets some points. They don't get as many resources for the next delve. There's some consequences there, which are unfortunate, but they get to keep playing and trying again. And that's, for this game, that's good, right? That's not for every game. Certainly that's a different aesthetic than some of the older schools of the game. But, what it does do is help, just save time with creating more characters and spending 5 hours going through the books to do that, and getting a campaign back on track and all that stuff, right? So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of this game is that players are encouraged to actually have multiple characters, right? One of the reasons we did this was we felt it was important in the Pathfinder 2 channel that we play a lot of Pathfinder, right? And so we had obviously the mainstream going on, but we wanted to have a private game going on as well, just so that we could really kind of kick the tires on this and kind of explore it in depth. So we wanted to make sure that players could have multiple characters here without real penalty, right? And the way that works is basically when you start a session, you can bring whatever character you want, and the campaign is actually what levels, right? So at the beginning of the game, the campaign's level 1, but after you play a few sessions, it might be level 3 or 4. And you have a level 3 or 4 character, but you could then bring in a new character at level 3 or 4 and just keep playing that. And then you have both characters. Now, there are some awards that will only go to the character that you played at that particular time, and you can't just create a character that has those awards, right? So there's incentive to play a character, but otherwise you can come in with a baseline character and be totally fine. And this, particularly George in our group, really played a lot of different characters just to kind of explore it, right? And Derek's switched at the end of the campaign from a cleric to a fighter just because he really wanted to see how broken the Flick Mace fighter was. Turns out it was as broken as advertised, so very devastating. So there's that aspect of it. And the entire game, as I mentioned before, is based off of the Pathfinder 2e baseline, so you can come in with a character right off the standard treasure tables and equipment and play this game and be fine. So that's that piece there. Then we talk about adventures, adventure section. I'll go over this a little bit in detail just because it's important. Every session follows the same phase, right? It starts off, you choose your party, and you show up, and you might have what's called a stable of characters, and you decide which character you're going to play that day, and all the other players decide what characters they're going to play that day. Once you choose your players, your characters rather, though I guess in some groups you might choose your players, that's fine. You then go into the settlement phase, and this is the downtime phase. Downtime is pretty important in this game, and this is where a lot of the rules actually expand the game. You have all your usual downtime activities, But I've always liked downtime. I've always liked the idea of time passing in campaigns. I think it's ridiculous that you could play a level 1 character and then 2 weeks narratively in the game you're like level 20 and battling gods. I think that's just crazy, right? So I love time passing. We played a 5e game, and by the end of it, because we use a lot of downtime rules, something like 3 or 4 years had passed, right? Which was good, right? In this campaign, I haven't done the math yet, but months would go by in between adventures, right? So a lot of time would pass. And I think that's great. It just really just lets the world breathe a bit, lets the characters kind of organically grow, and you have a sense of growth that isn't ridiculous. But also, downtime is fun, right? Downtime is kind of where you get to do and expand your character, where you do a little bit of world building, even in a game like this. It's kind of board game oriented. You can prepare for the next adventure. I love things like that, right? One of my favorite things about older D&D is preparation. The idea that, like, hey, if you really prepare for that journey, you're going to have an easier time. You're going to have a handle of it, right? So I really wanted to introduce those elements in there, not just because we enjoyed it, but I also think that these are elements that, as these modern games get more and more streamlined, we do lose them a bit, right? And I think it's cool to have a little bit of flavor in there. So if you're a newer player who hasn't had a chance to kind of experience some of that, there's a flavor of that preparing and actually thinking about what lies ahead in this campaign, which I think you might find interesting. So, but you can do lots of things in town, which I'll go over when we get into the settlement section. Then you go into the adventure the adventure selection phase. So there's an idea here of different delves you can choose into, and there's some tables that help support that, where you can basically generate what these adventures are going to be, and the players get to decide which adventure they want to go on. And prepare for that accordingly, right? So, in the case of our party, Derek's cleric was particularly potent against undead, so they would really try to find, dungeons that had lots of undead in it, or things you can do in the downtime phase is to change traits of these dungeons, right? So, they would use their actions to make a dungeon full of undead so that they know they could rock it, right? Then, once you are actually out and adventuring, you go through what's called a wilderness phase. This is kind of like a subsystem. This is a subsystem in Pathfinder 2. It's like a skill challenge in 4th edition. Basically, there's a certain amount of victory points you need to get before a certain amount of failure points. And that depends just how well you start the dungeon, right? Do you show up to the dungeon in great shape with some additional resources, or do you show up in the dungeon with, bad conditions and just not in a good place? And to kind of keep that interesting, there's also some events that occur during that phase, right, which we'll get into when we get there. So it's designed to be kind of like a relatively quick thing. Ideally you want it to be no more than 30 minutes, but kind of a good setup and tone shift from the town into the dungeon, right? And I felt like as a pacing mechanic, it worked really well. Because even a game like this, listen, we still got plenty of FBT, right? Not as much really as you'd expect in a normal campaign, but there was enough there and enough flavor to keep it fun. Because if you don't have that, then what are you doing, right? Just literally go play Gloomhaven at that point. But it was very useful from a pacing and narrative mechanic. After the wilderness phase, you have your first camping phase, and this is where the torchbearer influences really come in. The camping phase kind of lets you recover some resources and take a break from the delve. Very importantly, when you're in the dungeon, there are no trying to think of what's it called. There's no resting in the long-term recovery sense. There's no long rests, right? So you have your medicine checks and stuff like that, which you can do, but you're not going through a preparation phase in the dungeon. So basically, you have your loadout for today, and that's it. You gotta get through the whole delve in one go. But camp lets you recover some of those things like spells and daily resources and stuff like that, which can give you a break. And how much camp uses you have depends on the wilderness that you're in, how well you do in the wilderness, how well you make the camp, and also if you find supplies in the wilderness or in the dungeon, right? So there's a gameplay element there that if you succeed at, you can have a better camp phase and therefore do better in the delve. All right. Then the next phase is the delve phase. This is the dungeon phase. This is about exploration and about going through tactical mini combat, right? So lots of fights, right? And every delve ends in a dungeon, every delve ends in a boss. And the thing about this is to win a session to win a delve, you got to beat the boss. Everything else that happens is about atrophy. It's just about slowing the players down, wearing out their resources. In this game, time is a resource, so even depleting their hit points, normally that doesn't matter in Pathfinder 2 because you can make a heal check, but time is a resource, and we'll get into that when we get to the delve section. So what it does is it makes interesting choices that the players have to make with and consequences they have to contend with, and all that comes up to how well are you prepared for the final fight. And if you lose that fight, or lose any of the other fights and retreat at some point in the delve, you lose everything there, right? And if you win, you win. So we'll talk about that and the consequences there. And then at the end of the adventure, we figure out what happens. We calculate all the rewards and hand them out to the party. And they get their victory points, and or maybe the darkness gets a victory point, right? And then that's it. That's a session. And the way this is designed, like a board game phase, is if you got a lot of time, you have a full Saturday for players, you might run one or two of Darker Winter sessions in one day, and that's totally fine, right? So definitely, again, that board game mentality. So next chapter, moving into settlements. So there's one settlement. It's the main city. It starts off at level 1, and the city levels up as the party levels up. And there's things here you can do. You can, as you level, the city levels up. As you find supplies, you can actually level up different parts of the city faster. So, for example, my party leveled up things like consumables and armor shops and weapon shops faster, which meant that, I think at the end of the game, they had like a +3 to consumables, meaning that if the city was level 15, they could buy level 18 consumables, right? So things like that, right? And they kind of controlled how fast they could level it up. And then, of course, you have downtime actions. You have all your usual downtime actions, but you have some additional ones here. You can prepare to make the delve, change the traits of the delve. This represents your knowledge and research that you're doing in town. Oh, actually, this delve is filled with undead. Oh, actually, this delve has a rare treasure. It's a little meta. It's a little abstract, but basically, it's allowing the players to change the narrative in the game. So. And then you have a bunch of traits you can play with on the delves to make them kind of what you want if you want to spend your time on that. Crafting in this game is very different from the normal game. This is one of the things I did change, which if you played Northern Reaches, this won't be a surprise to you. We like crafting, but we hate the crafting rules. This one is here. It's just flat out better. I wanted people to spend time in town. I wanted people to craft things. And I wanted them to have a reason to do it, because if you look at how crafting works in Pathfinder 2, it doesn't make sense to craft. If you can buy something, it doesn't make sense to craft, right? So crafting only really works if you're not in a town and you can't shop. But given how this town works here with it leveling up, crafting was going to be pointless. But I like it. I like people taking feats. One thing in general about this book, I consider a compliment that people said, is it let them really think about feats and items and spells that they otherwise would just have never taken in a traditional Pathfinder game, right? And when you get particularly into delves, Derek was dropping swamp boats. I remember Tim was picking feats that let him move through rubble easier. Just lots of good and interesting choices that the players are making that you would never see in an AP, because so much of the game's DNA is still based around dungeon crawling, and really bringing that out in a interesting environment. It was just cool, right? Like playing Pathfinder 2, it felt like playing D&D in a good way, right? So where I did make changes to that core chassis, it really was to just bring out more of those kind of activities, right? Like if I did nothing with crafting, no one would have taken craft feats, and that would just stink, right? Instead, we had an eventer in the party, and craft was pretty cool, and Kaz crafted all the time, and I loved it, right? So crafting here is a little bit broken. It's you make a skill check on a success, it's 50%. It takes a week, so there was a little bit of difference there. If you fail, you still only pay 75%. So crafting was better if you had the skills, and that's how I wanted it to be. I wanted buying to be the worst option, because in my mind, if you could build something and craft something because you invested into those feats and traits, I feel like you should be rewarded for that, right? If you critical fail, you don't get the item, but you don't lose all your materials either. You just waste a week, which again is a resource, right? That's a big deal in this campaign. And crit success, you only pay 25%, right? So crafting is pretty powerful in this game. There's an idea here of quests. These quests are kind of very simple, very basic quests. They're randomly generated. If you've played Gloomhaven at all, this is where that system kind of comes from. The idea of additional little trials you can do in the dungeon. So you might get something where it's like, slay an elite and you get an extra magic item or something like that. So they're fun, but they're not big and they're pretty optional, right? I would say it ranged. Tim and Kaz would do a couple quests that they'd get into. Everyone else was just kind of meh on it. So, it'll vary if you're a party. And then the action that they probably used the most was Explore the City. And Explore the City is fun. So the way this works is there's a big table of events here of things that you can discover. And these things unlock additional things in the town. So you might find a laboratory. And then if you want to, you can buy that laboratory or invest that laboratory and then improve that laboratory. And then when you're in downtime, you just go back to your laboratory and you can do things like modify your spells and stuff like that, right? So sometimes you might get locked up because the guards arrested you for getting drunk. Sometimes you might find that you get married. Bob almost got married 4 or 5 times and had to kind of get through that, right? So it was a whole thing. The town section was very popular with the group, with the exception of Derek. Derek doesn't like fun, so he was very against this in every way. But everyone else very much enjoyed it. And this is where downtime really becomes an award, right? So you can do some very flat out broken things here if you invest the time in it. And keep in mind the time needed for this stuff is significant. These are multiple session investments that you're putting your downtime in. If you're putting your downtime in here, you're not doing other things like preparing for the delve. So there are choices there. Another big aspect of it is there's a random element to it, right? So one thing I would caution GMs, you might be tempted to do this. Do not let your players just pick and choose what they can find on this list, right? They're going to beg, they're going to ask, they're going to, well, can I just, find the lab? Don't give in, because part of that's a pacing mechanic. Part of it is that it should take a while to find these things, and you should be excited when you do find them. If you let your players pick the things that they want, they're going to go for the really good stuff right away, and it kind of takes some of the fun out of it. Not to mention, kind of, starts to tip your balance a little bit, right? Also, there are ways to eventually pick things, right? So there's options for players to invest in that let them kind of do that, right? So just be aware of that. But you have a lot of things in here you can get into. If you have like I said, a laboratory, you can really do things with crafting. You can improve spells. These are kind of like 3rd edition meta magic feats that you bake into a spell, and so they're just broken in Pathfinder 2. They're kind of like consumables, though. So one of the things with this is it doesn't completely eradicate the balance of the game, but it does let the players kind of like Nova a little bit if they really want to over-prepare for a delve, which I think is good, right? That gets back to that preparation aspect. There's feat research, right? So one of the things, probably the only thing I enjoyed out of Fall of Plaguestone was the reward they did there with what's her name? Nalia, the ranger? I don't remember her name. If you help her, she, regardless of your class, trains you in a feat that you can swap out, and it's a ranger feat. And you have to retrain your feat to pick that feat, but it kind of opens up your chassis a bit, where now all of a sudden you have a ranger feat, and maybe you were a fighter before, and I think that's really cool, right? So I always like that mechanic, and kind of added that in here with some of the libraries and training dojos that you can go into. And then, of course, there's just some additional broken things if you invest into it. But there's other things too, right? Things that are a little bit more narrative and world building, but still have mechanical benefits, right? You can buy a house, and the house lets you kind of build some of the features that you would otherwise find in town right into your house. So if you don't want to go find a laboratory, well, buy a house and build your own laboratory. It's more expensive and it's harder, but you can do that. And then because you're building it, you're not held hostage to the random table. So that's an example of where if a player really, really wants to do something, hey, okay, there's a way to do that. It's just going to be a little bit harder, right? And then part of having a house is, you could end up with a family, right? You have a wife and kids. You could get a title in the city, right? Become nobility. And these all have various mechanical impacts. Kaz was actually married and had a family. And one of the benefits of that was that Kaz's wife would basically make the party. This is an option in the book. Would basically make the party provisions when they'd go out on adventures. So, we used to joke that Kaz's wife was making delicious sandwiches for everyone. And the way that manifested in the game was that Kaz got 3d6 and he could hand them out to anyone in the party. And at any point in the adventure, if someone rolled a d20 and they didn't quite get where they wanted to be, they could add that d6 for that provision to kind of get them over the hump, right? And so it was a cool little flavor thing that tied into an obviously powerful mechanic that they could leverage, right? The title system does the same thing. If you have a title, it lets you kind of change how the settlement rules work and impact that a little bit. Kaz ended up being a count by the end of the game, so he could do things like gain additional downtime and change region traits, right? So change how the wilderness works to represent his influential power. He had resources that he could just go out there and kind of like make big changes, right? So lots of things like that. There's a guild system in the game where you could join a guild or build your own guild, and these give you additional passive perks. They play with all kinds of different things. You have a craft guild and religion guild, arcane, occult, primal, martial guild, criminal guild, entertainers guild, a government guild. You can get small adventuring crews and send them out and do delves for you and bring back stuff, right? So there's a whole cool little section in town, which is a lot of fun. And the idea of that was that, hey, people come back with downtime, they can spend their time on this, and it's entertaining. Then you get into adventure selection, and the rules for that are in the GM section, so I'll cover that when we get there. But you basically choose what adventure you want to go on to, and after that you go out into the wilderness, right? And in the wilderness, you have a bunch of different areas that you might explore. Everything in this game is broken up in a concept of tiers. If you've played 4th edition, this will make complete sense to you. If not, basically, I broke the leveling up into 3 sections: heroic, paragon, and epic. And this just affects things like overall difficulty and stuff like that. For the most part, it's all built in, right? Like, you level up, now you're paragon, but it does affect things, right? The game gets harder as you level up. So, in the wilderness, at the beginning of the game, you only need 5 successes to get through the wilderness. By the last delve, they needed 12. And that's just part of the game, right? So as you get more abilities, the things get higher stakes, right? So hard to do things. But there's a bunch of different regions here. Honestly, the regions, if you don't like these and you're running your own game, feel free to change them. They kind of don't overly matter. They're slightly balanced, where some of the better stuff is at the end of the game, but it's not a huge deal, and you can just kind of make these whatever you want, so you don't have to be restricted to it. Mine are kind of rather depressing because, like I said, I wrote this whole thing in about a week when I was just really sick back, I think, in January. So I think it's reflected here because these are all just really downers. But you can mix that up if you want something a little bit more. Then again, it was an apocalyptic campaign setting, so I guess it shouldn't be very exciting. But the way it works is, you make a challenge, and the book walks you through, how that should look like, and it gives you some, additional tables and whatnot in the GM section to keep it interesting. And then the party also gains additional exploration activities, so they can do fun things. So one of the things, as I mentioned before, that can happen in Wilderness is that you can, you'll get these random events, and you basically, if you've ever played Battlestar Galactica, you'll know that at the end of every turn, the Admiral gets to choose from typically 2 planets which one to go to, right? And that was kind of the idea here is, subsystems can be pretty boring as they are out of the book. So to make it a little bit more interesting, I wanted players to make interesting choices, right? And there is a table that will generate different options that the players choose, as a party. Hey, do we go left or do we go right? And, I tell them, if you go left, you're going to, come across the little mini dungeon. If you go right, you're going to lose a success, but you're going to gain supplies, right? And then they have a conversation and decide what they want to do, and it's cool, right? That's kind of all that you really want is just to have player agency and conversations. But the players have some additional actions they can do to kind of play with that system a little bit, right? And these are just in addition to things like actually beating the challenge, right? They can scout ahead, and scouting ahead, if they do a good job in the check, they can find additional events, right? Or even kind of get some of them pre-rolled, right? So They can fortify against the elements at the end of every turn, right? This is the cost, right? If you spend more time in the wilderness, you're going to take more damage from the wilderness, right? But they can spend an action to kind of reduce the effects of that wilderness. They can backtrack. So if the player is just really unlucky and they get a lot of failures, they can spend time to reduce those failures so that they're not completely out of the skill challenge. They can recall a shortcut, right? This is a cool one where, if those events that I roll, you can basically bank one and then bring it up later. If you get a bad roll later, right? They can do things like maintain equipment and prepare provisions. So these are very powerful. I'll just tell you right now, GMs, this is extremely powerful the way I wrote this. So you feel free to ban this from your game if you want. However, it's fun. Prepare provisions I talked about before. As I mentioned, Kaz's family had that ability for free, but prepare provisions is the ability where you make a check and you gain D6 and you hand out those D6s to your party and they get to use that when they need to, right? Maintain equipment is kind of nuts. And this is a similar concept, except the way this works is depending on how well you succeed, you roll D20s and you bank these D20s. So let's say you get a critical success. You get to roll 3 D20s and you roll a 3, a 10, and an 18. Well, you write those down, and then at any point during, whenever you can use it, which there's multiple versions of that rule, so it pops up between the wilderness and the delve typically. But at any point during the adventure, if you or the GM makes a roll, you can swap out that die roll for one of your banked rolls. And so what does this mean? Well, the obvious example here is if you miss and you really wanted to crit, you could swap out your bad roll for that 18 that you banked. And the 18's gone, and it's like you rolled an 18. But likewise, if the GM rolls a 20, right, and that's a crit, that's a death or whatever, right, or he rolls a 20 on a save against slow, you could give him the 3 instead, right? And now, well, it's slow, so your GM probably goes home for the night because he's done, right? So it can be very powerful, but obviously entertaining too. So that's one of the ones you want to maybe think about, right? We kind of went back and forth on that a little bit, but after that, you get into the camp section here. The camp section, the first thing you got to do is make a good camp, and the camp controls additional actions you can take in the game. You can do things like recover afflictions if you get messed up in the delve, recover your limited resources like your spells, invest magic items that you find. You can improve the camp. You can learn more about the dungeon, provide provisions, maintain equipment. You can counteract some of the environmental effects of the dungeons. All the dungeons have negative things that occur there. And you can safeguard your treasure. And that's an important thing, actually, because one of the consequences for losing in this is that all the treasure that you find, all the gold and all that stuff, if you don't beat the boss, you don't keep it. You don't keep it. You get your baseline Pathfinder treasure, right? So whatever your expected wealth is for that level, that's what you get to keep. And that's it. So that can be really rough. But if you safeguard your treasure, you get to keep some of it if you end up losing. So also, treasure at the beginning of the game is really heavy, so you just don't have. It's like 1 bulk per treasure, and a lot of players just don't have the room for it. So that lets you keep some of it in camp. Though at a certain point, you get a bag of holding that system. The entire system just doesn't matter. So after that, you're into the delve section. Delves are. So basically, the way a delve works is it's the RPGA model, 3+1, right? 3 encounters plus a bonus, right? Well, there's more than 1 bonus encounter in here if you want, but effectively, the main path is a hallway where you're going to go through a couple fights, maybe a skill challenge, and you fight the boss at the end, right? And when you're in here, things occur in exploration time, so 10-minute chunks basically. And after 6 ticks, everyone gets a point of doom, and this is called the doom clock. And basically, the longer you stay in the dungeon, the more doom you get until eventually you die, or you're so broken down by doom that if you do get dropped, you're going to die instantly, right? Now, if you go back to camp, it resets the doom clock, right? And again, that's one of the torchbearer elements in this game, right? The game is saying, hey, don't stay in the dungeon too long because you're going to get doomed, and that's going to mess you up and kill you. So you want to go back to camp, but you can't always go back to camp because you don't always have the resources to go back to camp. But also, you need time to explore the dungeon, right? Because there's things in there that you want to find. And the other aspect is, why don't I just run to the end and kill the boss? Well, because the main path doesn't have any goodies. All the goodies are on the side. So there's always attention. And it was great watching this in the group, right? Because Derek would be like, let's just get to the end. Let's just get to the boss, right? George would be like, nah, it's all about the side passages. We got to find everything, right? Bob was torn because Bob obviously wanted to go into the side passages to get all the extra loot. But his wife gave him a curfew, so he needed to be home exactly on time. And one of the rules I had, this was more of a personal house rule, was that if you don't finish the dungeon, then you lose. And I'll DM to a relatively late hour, but like basically, don't screw around, or that's it. You lose everything that you did that night. So Bob was always just like, well, I want the stuff, but I'm going to get in trouble if I don't beat the dungeon, right? So it was fun. It was always tension. And so what ended up happening is they would go into some of the rooms, and then they wouldn't go into all the rooms, and they missed some good stuff over the course of the campaign. But, hey, that's how it works sometimes. So there's lots of things you could find on the discoveries, lots of cool things. I kind of injected some of the old stuff. I'll just read the list down here, and again, the details are in the book. There's elite foes, which are harder monsters, but also contain more treasure. There's death traps, which are challenges, but again, contain more treasure. There's shrines, where if you pray, you can get a blessing specific from a certain deity. Laboratories, which lets you modify spells and items. Additional resources, which lets you have more downtime, lets you improve the town more, lets you have more camp. You can find treasure maps. Treasure maps are special items in this game that let you find better delves, which are just same difficulty. They're just worth more treasure, right? So it might be a level 5 delve, but give you level 7 treasure. It's just better. Good job. You had a treasure map. So those are valuable. Monuments, which give you hero points. Springs, which, take time, but lets you heal up really well and real effectively, including removing afflictions. So pretty interesting stuff. Forges. Actually, I don't think if the party ever found a forge when they were playing, or they didn't go into the room with the forge. These let you craft broken items. Fountains. If you've ever played an older D&D game, the idea of fountains and pools should bring a smile to your face. These are just random generators where all kinds of crazy things could happen to your character. Your character could gain some attribute bonuses. They could lose them, I think I made this one a little bit more toned down because it's Pathfinder 2, but that's just kind of the spirit of it. You can find weird objects. Weird objects it's a great little table system where you can generate all kinds of crazy things that just do crazy stuff, and it always just messes with your players. We had one, actually, I thought it was really cool. That we made that they came across, and it was this is what I rolled on the table. It was a ghost who was unaware and chaotic evil. It had a desire to slay an enemy in the dungeon, and the reward was it would give you a feat. And all the objects have an interaction power. When you interact with them, it can choose what to do. And in this case, and the way it works is there's a mechanical benefit and kind of like a narrative thing, right? The narrative piece was that it would always show you the character's desire, right? So whatever that character wanted, it would show it to you. It kind of think like the mirror in Harry Potter, right? And a player doesn't necessarily know what that means, right? It's like, oh, it's going to give me this, or if I use this, am I going to get this? Like, or is it an illusion, right? You don't really know. And then the object kind of decides based on who's using it what it wants to do. In this case, I had a negative action, which it could drain you. But it also had a positive action where it could reduce a condition. And Derek actually basically took this ghost and became possessed by this ghost willingly. And, the ghost wanted this because the ghost wanted to go and slay, basically the creature that killed it in its former life. And so for Derek, it gave it the ability to reduce a condition, right? It didn't crush Derek, but... it could have instead decided to just torment him and drain him, right? And then it also had the power of telekinesis, so the ghost could just like move things around, right? And so the narrative, what I wrote up based on what I wrote on this was this guy was his name was Karistor Bloodstaff, a little play there in Forgotten Realms, a slain mage of the old world. It wanders aimlessly until touched. When they found this ghost, it was just walking around raging that it had died, but it didn't ignore the party until they interacted. It ignored the party until they interacted with it. It seeks to possess a body and slay the creatures of the dark. Willing creatures can trade drains for feats or telekinetic projectile as a free action. Feat exchange is permanent until traded back. So, you took that drain and it was permanent, but you got a feat for it, right? So, Derek had this. He was possessed by a ghost, and then I think we forgot about it for the rest of the campaign, which was unfortunate. Even though I would put this card out on my screen to remind myself this was there and the ghost was there. I had big plans of having the ghost whisper, but it was Pathfinder 2, so my brain CPU was done all spent on calculating ridiculous mathematical equations to figure out if I hit by 1 or not. So anyway, those tables are in the book, and they're pretty cool and they're fun. And if you haven't done something like that before, it's a good way to kind of get started with that sort of concept of playing. You got non-hostile encounters. These are basically FBTs with potential rewards. I wanted to make sure I had some role playing in the game, just a little bit. So we had that. Warrior dojos where you can train up in feats. Puzzle vaults where there's basically kind of Zelda-esque puzzles that you could solve and get more treasure. Ley lines. I'm not sure they came across the ley line, or if they did, it was very early. Basically lets you restore your spells. Pools, which you can throw items in and things happen to your items. Sealed chambers, which require certain energy types to open, and inside could be monsters or treasure, you don't know. Libraries, which can play with your skill system, give you additional training and proficiencies. Dragon lairs, which they did come across, and these are kind of like classic narrative dragons, right? Like they're arguably too hard and too big to fight. So this is about like riddling and about entertaining the dragon, maybe getting treasure, maybe just not dying, right? So, and then empty rooms, which had a chance to not be empty, right? So, those were discoveries, and you in there could find all kinds of things like coins and items, settlement points, hero points, downtime actions, right? And so there's always that tension, like I said, with the players wanting to go off the side passages but needing to go down the main hallway, right? And then the last player chapter is Dark of Winter. This just talks about how the game ends. And the way that works is basically, you get enough points, and if you beat the Dark, you potentially can win, but you have to beat the very last boss, right? So it doesn't matter how many points you have. If you lose that last fight, you're done. And let me tell you, the session on Friday was super tense because they had a lot of points. They were going to win, and there's a scale that tells you just how well you win. And they were in position to win the big scale. But that fight, they were not confident that they were going to win. So we had some good tension throughout the game. So, all right, I know this video is already ridiculously long, and I'm not even sure I'm going to be able to edit this. According to my screen here, this is a 25 gig video, uncompressed. So going to need to wrap this up here. But the next section, the last section, is the Gamemaster section. This section has some good advice, things that if you have participate on the channel and you've heard Derek or I talk about, things like let the dice tell a story, low prep gaming, all those kind of concepts. So if you're new to GMing, this is, in my opinion, a kind of good summary of things that you might be interested in. And then it walks the GM through how to basically do all this stuff, right? So the idea of the low prep and no prep gaming is that you can just use this section to kind of build your adventures. I've tried it with no prep. It works. It is a little bit slower. It takes time to generate things. So depending on your time or your group, that may not be what you want to do. I found what worked best was low prep, which is basically an hour before the session. I go in and kind of set up what I want to do in the delve and roll everything I need to roll and for that. You don't always have to do that, by the way. If I had a particularly thematic dungeon, I would just build that. But this is good if you don't want to spend the time on it, or if you're looking for ideas. So again, they're just tools. This is kind of like the toolbox section of the adventure, but it walks you through how to build the different adventures. It walks you through a couple different systems here. Some of this stuff we ended up not using, to be honest. Originally there was this idea in here about how like dungeon opportunities would fade over time to kind of build tension with the group. It was just a lot of work to do at the table. When you have like 5 to potentially 10 weeks of downtime, if you're generating new adventures every week, that's just a lot of die rolling. So you might be into it. Feel free to use it. But we ended up cutting out. One thing I want to say in general about this book, We had big plans to go back and kind of edit and add some of the things that we learned in here. I'm really lazy, and I just didn't do that. So, and I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to make this long video that no one's going to watch to kind of talk about some of those ideas and concepts that we had, and then you can do that if you want, right? So, but that was one of the things that we'd probably have changed, is that, you know, just roll the adventures once and do that, right? You roll the adventures. The adventures have different traits. You roll those too. Traits affect things like the environment, the monsters, the rewards that they're going to find, how hostile the wilderness is. And those are things that the players can interact with in downtime, right, to kind of change those. There's a quest generation table in here. There's 3 different types of quests: basic quests that everyone can get, personal quests, which are supposed to be a little bit more tailored for players, and then epic quests, which actually take place across multiple sessions. And they have appropriate rewards and stuff for that too. I've always kind of gone back and forth with these a little bit. Some of the rewards feel out of line for some of the challenges. In the end, I think it was okay. This is not supposed to be a particularly strong system. It's just kind of here to add a little bit additional tactical choice and thinking to the players, right? So, you know, change it up as you want. Moving on into the wilderness, we have some wilderness generation stuff here. Wilderness, again, is abstract, so it's not like the Delve, where, you know, even in this book, I recommend you have a little bit of a sketch of the map. Like the wilderness is, you know, mostly narrative and skill challenges. Got a list of all the DCs in here just for convenience sake. The regions are broken out with the types of skills you can use in those skill challenges, the limited skills, the save and throws, the type of damage to expect, effects on failure. Again, a lot of this is, you know, up to the GM. Like, here, these are suggestions. Use what makes sense for you. Be careful of, you know, giving your players the fatigue condition in the wilderness, because that can lock them out of exploration actions. But if that's the kind of, you know, challenge that you want to have, then by all means do it, right? Like, let's see how the players deal with that, right? Tables for how many successes you need. The wilderness random event table. This is a kind of a cool system here. One of the things that I did regret doing is that there's a similar challenge system in the Delves, and I didn't add this system to that. I wanted to do that. I actually wanted to add like a deep crawl to the Delve section, and I didn't do that for 2 reasons. One, the Delve is already so pressed for time that, particularly my group likes to bullshit a lot, that introducing something like that would have probably just taken too long, and the players would just never get through it. And also, I just got lazy and I didn't want to re-edit this book. Like getting the images and the borders right and the formatting was just a super pain in the ass. I just didn't care. So that was honestly the bigger reason there. But you have the event system here, which was a lot of fun. A lot of people liked it. Even Derek liked it. So, you know, play with it, have fun with it, and then all the different types of events you can get and all the rules for that are right there. And then some stuff about camping, how that works. And then you get to the Delve stuff. And the Delve stuff here, you got a lot of tables, kind of inspired by the old various GMGs that kind of just help you build a dungeon. Not remember, this game is a lot more abstract, right? So I'm not getting into the, you know, it's a 15-foot hallway by 30 feet. That's not what this game is about, right? The size of hallways and rooms are narrative. There's are suggestions in here. You know, if you're playing in heroic tier, your rooms should be about 30 by 30. But if you're in epic, you should really be playing at 90 by 90. And some of that was stolen from 4th edition. Some of that was because players should have more mobility and actions at higher level. Honestly, one of the things that we found out in Pathfinder 2 is the game doesn't actually scale with size all that well. Some spells get increased and have better range. A lot of things don't and kind of stick at that 30-foot range. It's really weird, and it's probably an oversight. But it didn't work quite as seamlessly as it did in 4th edition. That being said, it still felt good. It still felt right. And one of the reasons you do need to do that is just because you have so many huge and gargantuan creatures by the time you're at epic level that you know, you don't have the room in a 30 by 30 room. So regardless, increase the size of your rooms as you level up. But this book isn't going to help you roll the exact space that you need in the rooms, right? It will give you ideas about what's in the hallways, right? So is it a trapped hallway? Is it a secret door? Is there illusionary walls? Things like that. And what I try to do here is hit up on a lot of just different things in the game, right? This follows a 3rd edition philosophy in that, you know, players who are not prepared for that challenge are going to have a hard time. Players who are prepared are going to own it because they're prepared. And that's the way that works, right? If you are not really prepared to deal with illusionary walls, you're going to miss things, right? Tim picked a character that, for some sort of gnome, I don't remember exactly what it was, but basically they had bonuses and abilities to detect illusionary walls, and it was great, right? That helped them with that, right? So, but in other things that they were weaker against. So there's always pros and cons, and the more random nature of how these delves are built kind of ensures that you're going to be exposed to lots of different things. So it walks you through all that stuff, and then it gives you a bunch of tables about building hazards and afflictions and how the different traps work. You could obviously use your standard traps and hazards right out of the book. There's nothing wrong with that. This is more if you want to kind of build something light and on the fly. If you've ever seen some of the kind of games that like Ben plays, you'll see things like spell generator, right, where it just gives you 2 words and you come up with a spell with that. And in some ways, this is more mechanical than that, but in some ways, this is a little inspired by that, where you'll have a trap here. It's a nature-based trap, and you disable it with survival, and it does damage based on the environment. So if you're in the cold place, it's going to do cold damage, right? And you might examples of this: pits, avalanches, bogs, lava, right? And it gives you that and the mechanics to run that all in one go, so you can just build it right there instead of having the full complex trap mechanic, right? So just kind of to speed things along and have the feel of the danger and adventure without going through the mechanical slog of it, right? And again, if you don't want to use it, don't use it, right? And we have a similar system for afflictions, because you might come across something that's cursed or disease and just want to quickly kind of have that work, right? So walks you through an example of what a delve can look like. Going into the delve, there's again similar setups of like the different types of environments within the delves itself. There's a turn effect system in this game. So for example, if you're in a cold environment, you're going to take cold damage every round if you're not prepared against it. Failing against the save for that could lead you to be slowed in the next encounter. Cursed places give you penalties to your defenses. This system here, honestly, I didn't use because I forgot about it. And what I mean by that is, again, I was just doing so much as a GM, I just didn't remember every 10 minutes to like harass the party. The party too is also particularly good at mitigating that, right? Which is the intent, right? Like if you're going into a cold environment and you're not, wearing cold weather clothing at low levels, or casting endure elements at higher levels, well, you're just kind of setting yourself up for failure to begin with, right? So. But again, use it if you want. If you don't want to use it, it's not going to be the end of the world. But for me, I just I just ran out of compute power to manage all this stuff, and also Pathfinder at the same time. Then you get into the combat counter setup. Here, sorry, I'm losing my voice. This is more than I talk in like a week. The combat counter kind of lays it out where you can have different monsters at various levels. You can you have what's called combat template. So you might get 2 monsters on level, 4 monsters at level -2, 8 monsters at level 4 or -4. Here's my take on all this stuff. So there's a couple things here. There's the delve layout, which determines, is it going to be 2 combats in 1 challenge or 1 combat in 2 challenges. You have the combat template, which is going to mess around with the levels. And then you get into the room terrain, which I'll talk about later. First off, the delve layout. I found, personally, 1 combat, 2 challenges. It was kind of boring. You're playing Pathfinder, you want to get in the fights. My recommendation is 2 combats and 1 challenge. That worked really well. It was really good pacing. And how you arrange those, I mixed it up every delve. I would have 1 delve where the challenge was first, and then it was just like 2 combats plus the boss. Or I would have the challenge right before the boss as a good pacing mechanic, or right in the middle. It honestly doesn't matter. But unless you go back and really make the challenges more interesting, which again, if you're a little bit more of a narrative FBT kind of group, that might work for you. You might want the 1 combat, 2 challenges. I would recommend just going 2 combats, 1 challenge. There's a table here to roll on it if you really care. You can just let the dice fall as they may, but That was our experience. The other thing I will say is the default assumption in this book is 80, 80, 120, meaning you're going to have 2 moderate fights, and you're going to have the boss, which is going to be a severe fight. For my group, that just did not work. I am playing with some pretty good Pathfinder 2 players, guys who've played RPGs since they were 12, so 30 years now in our case. Just very experienced. Derek runs a Pathfinder 2 channel, so that didn't really work out for them. So I ended up changing that for our group to 80, 120, 160. So every delve they fought in extreme, which according to the Pathfinder 2 rules means that's a 50-50 shot, right? So which they did a lot better than 50-50. But again, part of the fun of this game is if you play well and you explore the delves and you build up the town, you can get additional resources you otherwise wouldn't have. But the game is also very self-correcting, right? So if you get an advantage at low level, it's not like in 3rd edition where that might persist forever, right? Like Pathfinder 2, by the time you're level 5, if you haven't maintained those gains, you're going to be totally balanced because of the way the gold economy works, right? So it was something where they had to play well every session to keep playing well throughout the game, which really at that point, I mean, there's nothing to complain about. Like your players are playing the game hard. Yeah, you want that as a game master, right? So I didn't have any complaints there. Also, by the end of the game, everything balances out anyway because you can't buy things that are higher than 20th level. So they went into that last fight. It was pretty on, and I would say it was a 50-50 shot they got out alive. So the math is tight. So anyways, that was my group, and I had to give them a little more of a challenge. Now your group may not be quite that optimized, right? Your group may not have Derek going, you need to take these items, otherwise the math will break down for you. So you might want to stay with the 80, 80, 120, and that's totally fine. Figure out what's right for your group, play with that. Same thing with the combat template. I would say 8 monsters at level -4 for my group. That's a waste of time, right? 4 monsters at level -2 is debatably a waste of time, just because they're gonna slaughter them. They're just gonna blow right through them. But your group might not be as optimized, right? And in which case you can do that, and it's fine. You might also just want the pacing mechanic, right? Like my guys, they wanted to get into fights. They wanted to have hard fights. That's why they built their characters, right? You might have a party that is okay with just blowing through some bad guys, and feeling cool, right? So great, do that. And if you don't care or you don't know, use the random table just to keep it interesting, right? One thing that's a challenge, and I'll say, there's this monster trait system in here where you roll the random traits for the delve. I'm just going to flat out tell you guys, this does not work. Like, I apologize. This is just a complete failure because there just are not enough monsters across the different categories in Pathfinder to make this a useful system. I used it to inspire, right? And I would try to kind of land in there, but, listen, guys, there's only so many oozes in the game, and they don't go through 1 through 20, right? You run out beasts, you run out humanoids pretty quick. So the game changes, and there's just not a lot of monsters in these categories to make it worthwhile. Some of these categories did not work out as well as I'd hoped. So that's just a failure on my part. Honestly, I'd say use whatever you want for monsters, make it work. Tell your players what to expect. That's part of how this game works, is the preparation phase. Your players should know what kind of foes they're going to go up against. But rolling them randomly, if that doesn't work for you because you can't find a level 13 monitor creature, then yeah, just throw that out and just do whatever you need to do there. Particularly too, if you're trying to find a level 13 monitor creature, but then also a level 9 a group of beasts, right? Like, this is where it can get annoying in the prep. So just don't overthink it and just make it work. Room terrain. So this is something that we had a lot of fun with early on in the game. We used less of it as time went on, just because of how big all the creatures were, and it just it was just a lot to manage. But This kind of makes the combats interesting, and it adds things like cover, which makes range characters have to think and use strategy. It also gives you a defense mechanism against the monsters, right? I remember one time there was a dragon, and there was kind of like these two big like I don't know, 30-foot wide columns in the room, and the party would basically kite the dragon around the columns to avoid its breath weapon, right? So that was good play using the terrain, right? And that's kind of what this is here, is like really enhancing that tactical part of the game, right? There's concealment. I think it's important to throw concealment in the game because there's lots of abilities to get around concealment, and players should feel rewarded for taking those feats and or spells or whatever. And if players don't take that, they should feel like that sucks, right? And that sucks because they didn't take that to take something else, which is going to make them better at that thing, right? That concept is very important. Rewarding players that take abilities that make things easier for them, and penalizing players that don't take those abilities to make this thing harder, right? So difficult terrain, same concept. It's a tactical thing to think about. Things are slower, but some characters have the ability to get through that. And if you don't add difficult terrain, you're making those feats worthless, right? Dangerous terrain. This is always fun, right? Add lava, poison, acid, right? Just remember, if someone gets pushed in the lava, they're not out of the campaign. They can come back. So, how that happens narratively, that's on you, Dungeon Master. Maybe at the last moment they caught on. I don't know, but throw those things in there and let your players push bad guys in there and try to push them into it, right? Have fun with that. Uneven terrain. This is a terrain type in Pathfinder, and again, it gives characters with acrobatics and those appropriate feats a chance to shine with that. Traps, you could throw traps in there. I did this earlier on. I stopped doing it later on just because I got lazy. But, I remember there was a room with a boss and had a bunch of fireball runes in there, and George's character, decided the best tactical thing to do was to literally throw himself in a fireball rune so that his players had room to maneuver. So they won the fight. So, and we also have power terrain. Power terrain's kind of a concept I stole from 4th edition. It just really changes the rules of the game, right? So it adds things that, if you stand on certain areas, it increases your damage or let you crit more, or, lets you teleport around, and all kinds of fun stuff in there. So it's just a really good way to add some wackiness to your combats in a tactical way. So moving on in the rest of the chapter, it talks about, just more GM advice if you don't know how to really play Pathfinder 2 or don't know how to play this flavor of it. It goes into the rules about discoveries, the treasures you can get, all the things, all the discoveries, all the different types of shrines you can get. Honestly, a lot of this book at this point is just tables, right? How the fountains work, the random things you get off the fountains, the rules for everything, non-hostile encounters, dragon lairs, the pools and what they do. Let's see what else. Weird objects. And then, at the end, you have a dungeon dressing table here. This is just general, every room kind of stuff laying in there. Some small random things used for flavor, but also there's mechanical benefits here. This is how players can get additional supplies. If they don't actually find a supply room, there's still a chance they can come across additional supplies or treasure, just exploring the rooms that they do come across. So this was a fun system. I think the players enjoyed it, and it kind of introduced additional narrative and creativity into the environment. So you weren't literally just, it's a boss fight. It's a moderate encounter, right? You had between this and the terrain just enough flavor to make it interesting. But because it's Pathfinder 2, it's all mechanical flavor. So everything did something. There's slime on the walls, that does something, right? And then these tables kind of help with that. And then the treasure table at the end. So I do want to talk about the treasure table here a little bit. If you do the math on this, you realize that this is a little bit more busted than the standard PF2 treasure table. And that's intentional. Derek and I, went over this table pretty early on and thought about it and decided this is actually what it should be. Because what this lets you do is have more money for things like consumables. And that's very important in this kind of game. If you're going to have a game that's based on preparation, you really need to have the ability to prepare, and consumables are a great way to do that. So, if you do the worst possible ever in this game, or whatever, make a new character and just get the base rewards, you'll still have a little extra change to kind of play that part of the game, which is cool. But the other thing about the treasure table here is if you play very well, if you play, uncommon dungeons, rare dungeons, if you find additional treasures, you can get a lot of money very quick. And yeah, that's busted, right? You're going to buy more stuff. But here's the thing to remember about Pathfinder 2, right? In 2 levels, you're basically under wealth, right? So it's a short-lived victory that your players can have fun with, and they'll get mechanical benefits out of it. They'll come in with more scrolls. They're going to come in with a couple more items. Honestly, for me, I like the flavor of that. If you don't like the flavor of that, you can tone this down a bit if you want. But for me, I think the default APs are too stingy. I think that players should have, like, I'll give you an example. I think that, but default Pathfinder 2, you can't be a fighter and have a good magic sword and a good magic bow because you just don't have the wealth for it. And it's dumb. And we know by the math, if you don't have a good weapon that's current and up to date with the right runes, you might as well just throw it away, right? It's pointless because you're never going to hit. You're never going to do sufficient damage if you do get lucky and hit, right? In a game like this, you could be a fighter who's focused on his sword, but has a bow, and the bow's got, the same type of rune in it. You're doing the same amount of damage. You're hitting out +2 with 2 additional damage die. And I think that's cool, right? Because you're still not as good as the guy who specialized in the bow, but you're not pointless. You're not just, like, utterly worthless, right? So I think that that's a cool thing, right? And then you also can buy things that you otherwise wouldn't buy. Buying consumables is horrible in this game. Why would you buy consumables? You know how tight the math is and how much the gold matters to buy that next thing, right? But in this game, you have more room to go and do that. And because of how the math works, you can't just automatically go up and buy the next level, right? Because it's just so much money that's required for that. But you can play around in the space that you're in, right? Or flesh out your items a little bit more to get more of those skill check bonuses, which, again, in this game matters. You're making a lot of skill checks in this game. So having a little bit of extra help there isn't a bad thing. So I liked the wealth. I thought it played pretty well, but it is more powerful than your traditional Pathfinder game. So just throwing that out there, that can be a thing. And then how to wrap up your game, how to wrap up the campaign. There's a table here at the back that basically tells you, hey, if you got enough points, this is how they did. It ranges from, hey, you won, but you didn't really win because you didn't get enough points, so you lose, to, 71 plus points where, hey, you broke winter and you come out of the dungeon and spring is here and blah, 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 right? But then there's the ultimate defeat, right? And this one you can get no matter how many points you have. If you lose in the last battle, the world is devoured in darkness. So you got to win that last fight. And, there's definitely a couple points there where I saw the despair on Derek's face and Bob's face. And, nothing really bothers Kaz all that much. And I think George embraces the chaos. So those two guys mostly, where they're like, I don't think we're going to pull this off. So, but they did. So anyways, this, I fantasized about doing this in 10 minutes. It's been an hour. So classic. I'll try to, edit this and maybe put some breaks in it. I don't know how that works. I'll have to ask Derek. But like if we can slice it up by chapter or something. But I just want to say, it was fun writing this. It was fun playing it. I think we really got a chance to kind of like put Pathfinder 2 through its paces. I think we actually played Pathfinder 2 in a way that a lot of people don't get to play, right? Like we got to explore these aspects of the game that just don't come up often in the APs, and that was really cool, right? It was really cool seeing these weird items and feats that normally you would never take suddenly be really awesome and useful, and the players really liked that, right? I enjoyed the delves. I thought the discoveries were fun, and seeing the tension with exploration as well as just like trying to get through it in a timely fashion felt really good to me. I felt that the downtime summit stuff was a lot of fun, and people had a good time with that. I loved seeing people build up their houses and gain titles, and Bob was super into his laboratory, which was neat. I like all that stuff. The wilderness was a really good kind of pacing mechanic to kind of get people to transition to the dungeon, and we had a lot of fun with that, a little bit of FBT. And, that kind of tension at the end, the players are always kind of thinking about, well, if we lose at the end, right? And then that became a near reality, right? As they go into that last delve. And that was just kind of cool to see. So I think it was good. So if you really like Pathfinder 2 and are kind of intrigued by some of the stuff we talk about on the channel, the older kind of stuff, this is the way to play Pathfinder 2, but get a flavor of that, get a little bit of a taste of that, right? It's not the same experience, but it's a good emulation of that experience. And again, the majority of this game is Pathfinder 2. I built around it. I didn't really change that core game all that much, because the whole point was to play Pathfinder 2. So you can kind of just add this on top and play the game as you know how it, and it should work. And when we would get into the fights, I was just playing Pathfinder 2. I was using Pathfinder 2 monsters. I didn't even make my own monsters up. I wanted to make sure my guys had the authentic experience. So that's what we did there. There's a couple different variants, I guess, you could play with this. We kind of toyed around a little bit with, since this was a play test. We didn't want to wait 2 years to get this out to you guys. And you could do it like a level 1 through 10 campaign, or 10 through 11, 11 through 20 campaign. 10 sessions instead of 20. What we thought was really cool was the idea of maybe a 10 level or 10 session campaign that went like 1, 3, 5, 7. So every other level instead of like a straight level. And then basically every session you're getting access to new spells and stuff like that. And so that was cool too. And if you want to do something like that, just be aware of like things like the victory points, right? You're going to want to double up the victory points that players earn so that they can still be on the scale. How I balanced downtime, because they effectively had less downtime, was to give them an extra week of downtime if they did that. So I would say we played, probably the first half of the game, straight, and then we started playing around with that aspect a little bit just to see what that was like. And there's some rules in here too to talk about things called hard mode, right? So if you have players who want a harder challenge, they can double level if they beat a dungeon of higher level, right? And the book talks about that. So a lot of different things there to play with. But yeah, just to be very clear, this isn't going to be for a lot of people. This is a gamification of Pathfinder 2 in an extreme sense. I think it brings out some of its strengths and some of its hidden strengths at that. But it's very gamey. It's not particularly plot driven. There's enough in there to play a role playing game, but this isn't an epic story or anything like that. I think for most people, they're going to be able to take some of the rules out of this and add it to their own campaigns, which is great. But I'm not expecting too many people are going to be sitting down playing Darker Winter campaigns. But if you do, that's great. That's awesome. Let me know how it goes. Very interested in your feedback. I'll be on the Discord as usual, so feel free to send me your messages and questions or comments. Change it if you want. Me personally, I'm going to probably move on and do something else now. I'm kind of good with this. This is done, and we're good with that. I'm going to think about some other stuff now and see where that goes. But thank you if you've managed to listen through this long ass video. Thank you for your time. Thank you as always for your support on the channel. The Knights are we can be a dour group, but honestly, it's just incredible that this community exists, that this community, is interested in playing with us and talking games about us. Never did we ever think that was something that was going to happen. Derek started this almost as a kind of a joke, and because he had $30,000 in photography equipment that he wasn't using. We never even imagined that like 4 people would watch a show, let alone 30 to 50 to over 100 depending on the episode, right? Like that's just bonkers, right? We never imagined that there'd be over 150 people on a Discord that want to talk to us, right? So it's awesome, right? And what's great too about the past year or so is just really getting to expand the gaming horizons, right? I've learned a lot, not just about this game, but just all kinds of different games and how people play them and the different types of games out there. I own 7th Sea now, which is something that I did before this Discord, right? So and I think that's awesome, right? I really diving into the hobby and just exploring it, and it's great to be able to do that for all you guys. And it's great, thanks to your support, that we get the time to do this, right? I get to spend my time talking about something that, might interest some of you guys. And that's awesome. So long way of saying thank you very much for your support and all that you do. And, we're looking forward to running more shows and talking more about games and showing you guys more of those games and, having cool videos. So with that, have a great 4th if you're in the States. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend. I am wrapping this up, and peace.